The last time Russia built a ring of missiles around Moscow, the enemy was America. The year was 1950. Stalin had just watched the United States drop 2 nuclear bombs on Japan, and he was terrified that the next bombs would fall on Moscow. So he ordered an emergency program, gave his scientists 12 months to produce a working missile defense system, and within a few years had ringed his capital with 56 missile batteries in 2 massive concentric circles, stretching from 25 nautical miles out to 45 nautical miles from the city center. 2,640 launchers. Thousands of missiles buried in concrete bunkers along roads built specifically to move weapons into position. It was the most heavily defended city in human history at the time, built entirely because a superpower was afraid of being hit at home. That system, known as the S-25 Berkut, sat largely dormant through the Cold War, slowly aged out of service by the 1980s, and was finally retired as the Soviet Union collapsed. The rings around Moscow became relics. The roads built to carry missiles became suburban highways. The bunkers were abandoned. Russia no longer needed to protect its capital from an enemy that could reach it. And then Ukraine got drones. And now, for the first time in decades, Moscow is building the rings again. This story is not just about air defense systems and satellite imagery of missile towers. It is about what is happening to the fundamental strategic reality of this war. The fact that Moscow, the seat of Russian power, the city where Putin's regime runs, the city where Russian generals live and where the Kremlin stands, is no longer safe. And Russia's response to that, piling system on top of system, ring on top of ring, stripping air defenses from other regions to concentrate protection around the capital, is itself creating a new set of vulnerabilities that Ukraine is already learning to exploit. Start with the physical reality of what Russia has built. According to an extensive investigation by Radio Liberty, based on satellite imagery and open source intelligence data, more than 50 new surface-to-air missile positions were constructed around the Moscow region in the 2 years following Ukraine's first drone strike on the Russian capital in May 2023. That first strike, which hit the roof of a building inside the Kremlin itself, was described by Moscow as a terrorist attack by Ukrainian intelligence. But what it actually was, in strategic terms, was the moment Russia's capital lost its psychological immunity. From that day on, Moscow was a potential target, and the Russian military responded accordingly. Pantsir S-1 short to medium range air defense systems began appearing on rooftops across Moscow, including on the roof of the Russian Ministry of Defense building itself. S-300 and S-400 long-range batteries were repositioned to cover key corridors into the city. And something even more striking began to emerge in satellite imagery. New construction at sites along the Central Ring, Road, and the so-called Small Concrete Road, a Soviet-era circular highway built specifically in the Cold War era to transport missiles to air defense positions around the capital. Russia was not just adding new systems. Russia was rebuilding its Soviet-era defensive architecture, occupying the same physical sites where the S-25 Berkut had stood 70 years earlier, planting new Pantsir towers on the same concrete foundations where Stalin's emergency missile program had placed its launchers. The Russian military was, quite literally, haunting the bones of the Cold War. By 2025, the construction had accelerated dramatically. Satellite analysis published by Bild in May 2026, based on imagery reviewed by OSINT analysts, identified 43 newly installed air defense tower positions, constructed around Moscow in 2025 alone. These towers were specifically designed to elevate Pantsir systems to a higher firing position, giving them better angles against low-flying drones that hug the terrain to avoid radar detection. The total number of air defense units surrounding Moscow, counting Pantsir batteries, S-300 systems, and S-400 batteries together, had by May 2026 grown to exceed 100 individual systems, 100 distinct anti-aircraft units ringing the Russian capital. And Zelensky himself confirmed in a public statement just before Russia's May 9th Victory Day parade that additional rings had been added in the weeks before the event, noting what he called a large-scale redeployment of systems from Russia's regions to build up the Moscow perimeter. An analysis published by Kyiv Post noted that Putin's private residence at Valdai, which was simultaneously blurred on the Russian navigation service Yandex Maps in an apparent attempt to hide its location, had been surrounded by more than 25 dedicated air defense systems on its own. The man who runs Russia is protecting his home like a military fortress. None of this happened casually. It happened because Ukraine kept hitting Moscow. After the May 2023 Kremlin strike, drones reached Moscow in waves throughout 2024 and into 2025 and 2026. On the night of May 4th, 2026, just 5 days before the Victory Day parade, a Ukrainian drone struck a 36th floor apartment in a high-rise on Mosfilmovskaya Street in western Moscow. The building, known as the Mosfilm Tower, is one of the most upscale residential addresses in the city. It sits approximately 6 kilometers west of the Kremlin, 3 kilometers from the Russian Defense Ministry building, one of the closest strikes ever to the physical seat of Russian government power. Moscow Mayor Sergei Sobyanin confirmed the attack. Videos posted to Russian social media showed the drone flying at low altitude toward the city just after midnight, followed by the sound of explosions echoing across the capital. Residents of one of Russia's most expensive neighborhoods filmed the gutted upper-floor apartments, and Russia had no comment beyond a brief reassurance that no casualties occurred. 6 kilometers from the Kremlin. That number deserves to sit with you for a moment, because of what it means strategically. Ukraine has been launching long-range drones from inside its own territory, flying them through hundreds or thousands of kilometers of Russian airspace, past air defense networks that Russia has been building and reinforcing since 2023, and landing them within walking distance of the Russian seat of government. These are not coincidences. These are not lucky breaks. This is the product of Ukraine systematically degrading Russia's air defense network through a sustained suppression campaign. Between June 2025 and March 2026, according to Belfer Center Research, Ukraine conducted confirmed strikes against 237 air defense-related targets across Russia, launcher units, radar systems, and electronic warfare infrastructure. Every radar Ukraine destroys creates a blind spot. Every launcher Ukraine hits removes a layer of protection. Russia has been building new positions as fast as Ukraine is hitting the old ones, but it cannot build them everywhere at once, and every Pantsir battery or S-400 launcher that travels to Moscow from Belgorod or Bryansk or Kursk is one that is no longer protecting those regions. That last point is the strategic trap that Russia has walked into, and it is one that military analysts watching this war have described as a genuine structural crisis for Russian defense planning. When Russia strips air defense systems from its border regions to concentrate them around Moscow, it does not just leave those regions more exposed to Ukrainian attacks. It leaves the Russian forces fighting in eastern Ukraine with less air defense coverage along their own supply lines and rear areas. It means that when Ukrainian drones and missiles fly toward Russian logistics depots, ammunition stores, rail nodes, and command posts in the occupied territories and in the Russian oblasts bordering Ukraine, there are fewer intercept systems available to stop them. It creates a cascading vulnerability. Protect the capital, expose the front, protect the front, leave the capital open. Russia cannot fully do both simultaneously, and the more its air defense resources are sucked toward Moscow, the more those resources are unavailable for the battlefield, where the war is actually being fought day by day. The analysts at RFE/RL summarize this trap precisely. Russia's apparent reluctance to redeploy assets from the tight ring around Moscow, driven by fears of bringing the realities of war too close to the regime's door, makes the broader problem of defending all of Russia's territory simultaneously worse. It is a self-reinforcing constraint. The more the Kremlin fears for its own safety, the more it concentrates protection around itself. The more it concentrates protection around itself, the weaker other areas become. And the weaker other areas become, the more Ukraine can strike them, which in turn demonstrates that nowhere is truly safe, which increases the Kremlin's fears, which drives more concentration of systems around Moscow. Round and round it goes, and at each turn the Russians are worse off than they were before. This is also where the history connects back to the present in a way that reveals just how psychologically significant what is happening actually is. Stalin built the Yelus, Berkut rings, not because NATO had actually struck Moscow. He built them because of fear, because he had seen what air power could do to cities, because the memory of German bombers over Moscow in 1941 was fresh, because the nuclear destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had shown that a single aircraft could erase a city. The rings were a physical manifestation of existential anxiety. They were built at enormous cost, consuming a year's worth of concrete production, requiring a construction program comparable in scale to a major Soviet industrial project, not because the enemy had actually arrived, but because the enemy theoretically could. Putin's new rings around Moscow are being built under conditions that are, in this crucial respect, even more acute than Stalin's. Ukraine is not a theoretical threat to Moscow. Ukraine has already hit Moscow. Ukraine hit the Kremlin roof. Ukraine hit an apartment tower 6 kilometers from the Kremlin. Ukraine flew drones over Moscow neighborhoods that once considered themselves entirely removed from the war. And Ukraine is getting better at this with every month that passes. The numbers illustrating that progression are striking. According to French open-source researcher Clément Moulin, Ukraine launched approximately 1,000 drones into Russia in August 2024. By July 2025, that monthly volume had tripled to around 3,000. By March 2026, it had reached 7,000. And for the first time in any single month of the entire war, Ukraine launched more cross-border attack drones into Russia than Russia launched into Ukraine. That is an inversion of one of the most basic asymmetries of this conflict. and it reflects the scale of Ukraine's domestic drone industry transformation. From essentially zero indigenous long-range drone production at the start of the full-scale invasion, Ukraine had by early 2026 built an industrial base capable of producing and launching weapons at a volume that exceeds Russia's output in the same category. And crucially, the range of these drones keeps expanding. Ukraine launched a drone strike that covered 1,700 kilometers to hit a refinery in the Perm region. Flamingo cruise missiles traveled over 1,500 kilometers to strike the V-Anier Progress defense plant in Kaboksary. Air raid alerts were triggered across 18 Russian regions simultaneously. A missile threat siren sounded for the first time ever in the Pantsir region, more than 2,000 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. Russia no longer has a geographic sanctuary anywhere. The most visible symbol of what all of this has done to Russian confidence was the May 9th Victory Day parade in 2026. For nearly 2 decades, Putin had used Victory Day as the crown jewel of Russian propaganda. A day when rows of tanks, intercontinental ballistic missiles, nuclear-capable rocket systems, and the latest Russian military hardware rolled down Red Square's cobblestones in front of the world's cameras while Putin stood at the reviewing stand, projecting total control and military dominance. The event was designed to communicate one thing above all else. Russia is powerful. Russia is unchallengeable. Russia will prevail. In 2025, more than 2 dozen world leaders stood in the stands alongside Putin, including Chinese President Xi Jinping, as thousands of troops and dozens of weapon systems paraded through the capital. In 2026, Russia's defense ministry announced at the end of April that no military hardware would be displayed at the parade. Not tanks, not missiles, not armored vehicles of any kind. The stated reason was the current operational situation. Privately, every analyst in the world understood what that meant. Russia was afraid to roll its most advanced military hardware through Moscow's streets because Ukraine might hit it. The Kremlin added that mobile internet service and texting would be restricted across Moscow on parade day to prevent drones from using cellular networks for navigation, because the threat was real enough that Russia was willing to shut down digital communications across its own capital city to try to reduce the risk of an attack. 11 Russian regions canceled their local Victory Day celebrations entirely, citing security concerns. Chuvashia, whose capital Cheboksary had been struck by a Flamingo missile just 4 days before the parade, was among them. Crimea, where a drone strike killed 5 people on the day before the parade, canceled its events as well. The parade itself lasted approximately 45 minutes, one of the shortest in modern Russian history. When it was over, the defense ministry announced that mobile internet restrictions were being lifted, a statement that inadvertently confirmed just how tightly the Kremlin had been gripping its own capital in fear of the sky. And the video screens at Red Square that showed footage of Russia's military hardware, the tanks and missiles and systems that Putin had decided were too vulnerable to actually put on the street, revealed the gap between the image Russia wants to project and the reality it is now living in. Russia could not let its own weapons parade through its own capital because a country it invaded is capable of hitting them from over 1,000 kilometers away. The iron ring Russia is building around Moscow is not, in itself, likely to fail in every engagement. Some drones will be intercepted. Some attacks will be stopped. The 100-plus systems encircling the capital do create a genuine layered defense that is harder to penetrate than anything Russia had before 2023. But air defense systems are not impenetrable. Ukraine has already proven that by landing a drone 6 kilometers from the Kremlin despite everything Russia has built. And more fundamentally, the ring represents a massive ongoing investment of resources, personnel, and strategic attention that could have been used elsewhere, that is being pulled away from other areas, and that reflects not Russian strength, but Russian vulnerability. A country that has to spend this much energy, this much hardware, and this many political resources protecting its own capital from an enemy it claims to be defeating is not behaving like a country that is winning a war. Stalin built his rings of missiles around Moscow because he was afraid. He was right to be afraid. Nuclear weapons were real, and the Americans had them, but his rings were never tested. The bombers never came. The S-25 Berkut sat in its concrete bunkers for 30 years and was retired without ever firing a missile in anger. Putin's rings are being built under very different conditions. The drones have already come. They keep coming. And each time one gets through, each time a building in Moscow bears the marks of Ukrainian hardware, each time a siren sounds in a city that thought it was safely behind the war, the ring gets bigger, and the fear driving it grows more acute. Russia is not building this ring because it expects to stop Ukraine. Russia is building this ring because it cannot afford to stop building it, because the alternative, Moscow undefended, Moscow open, Moscow reachable by whatever Ukraine decides to send next, is not an option for a government whose political legitimacy rests entirely on the image of a leader who cannot be touched, who cannot be frightened, who presides over a country that dominates rather than cowers. That image is fracturing. The rings of Pantsir towers going up around the central ring road, the surveillance cameras installed in the homes of Putin's personal staff, the bunkers in Krasnodar where Putin spends weeks away from the public eye, the pre-recorded videos fed to state television while he hides, the Victory Day parade that showed a video of tanks instead of actual tanks because real tanks might get hit. All of it points to the same thing. Russia invaded Ukraine, expecting a quick victory, expecting no retaliation on its own soil, expecting that the war would remain a one-directional exercise in power. What it got instead was a country that refused to break, that built its own weapons industry from scratch, that reached deeper and deeper into Russia with each passing month, and that ultimately forced the aggressor nation to build a wall of missiles around its own capital. Not because Ukraine is invading Moscow, but because Ukraine has made Moscow understand that the sky above it no longer belongs to Russia alone.